Welcome to another joint podcast between EndurHunt and First Gen Hunter. Kent is joining me to talk all about shed hunting because I know nothing about shed hunting. And I think there are a few people that I have interacted with that enjoy it as much as Kent does. So if
Oh
you've never
yeah.
heard of me before, I'm Andrew from the EndurHunt podcast, joined by,
I am Kent Boucher, the host of the First Gen Hunter podcast.
thank you for coming on and talking about shed hunting. Like we've talked about it before. I really don't know anything about shed hunting. I have found two sheds in my life. Actually, you can see them on the shelf behind me if you're watching.
Ah, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, the one I'm pointing at right now was on a different friend's house. We were talking before about Texas. We were riding on an ATV and I saw it sticking out of the mud and found it on accident in a creek bottom.
That's awesome.
And this one was while pronghorn hunting. It's a mule deer shed, and I found that one just walking some basically big fields looking for pronghorn, and just so happened to see it laying on the ground. I have never found sheds looking for sheds. I've done it maybe twice,
Well, you
so I'm
sound,
hoping you can help me out here.
yeah. Once you start looking for them, you won't find them. So I just keep doing what you're doing, man.
I don't know, man. 7 years now and only two sheds. My track record's not very good. um, but I think, it makes sense to just kind of start at the beginning. We're both first gen hunters here.
Yep.
How did you get started in shed hunting? I feel like that's not something that most first gens are going to just dive into.
Yeah. First of all, thanks a ton for having me back on your show, Andrew. Always enjoy talking with you. You're a good friend and a good guy. And I don't know, you give me a good sense of ease. Like I'm talking with a guy who can relate to what it takes to do what we're trying to do. So it's always good coming here. But I got into shed hunting actually I think it was 1 year before I started hunting, at all. Not even pheasant hunting or anything like that. I truly got into shed hunting first. And that would have been in the winter of 2015. So I think this will be my 11th shed hunting season. I mean, I kind of knew about it. I think I found out that sheds were such a thing when I was in grade school. I had a friend whose parents had bought this property. Of course, I didn't understand any of this at that time, but turns out in prime whitetail country, as good as it gets anywhere, basically, in Illinois. And they had some like trails that they would, ride dirt bikes on and stuff like that going through their timber. And, they were grade school kids. So we'd play around in the woods and stuff like that. And I remember they brought me to this like little stockpile of cool stuff they found in the woods that they stashed, in some tree or something. And that was when I first saw what a shed, saw a shed. And they had found, one or two sheds while they're playing around out there. That was, and so it like always kind of stuck with me, and I knew what they were. If somebody talked about a deer shed antler, I knew what they were talking about because I had that early experience. But I wish I've tried to rack my brain and think back to, man, what did that antler look like? And I think the only thing I can remember is one of them was all busted up and chewed up and everything. But maybe that, now that I think about it, maybe that was kind of because I don't know. It's just funny that I can remember that from you're talking almost 30 years ago, and I can still remember having that experience. So it must have been pretty impactful, just from an imprinting standpoint. And but I never went shed hunting after that. I never even really looked for sheds. And my brother, his best friend, kind of grew up the opposite way, where he was hunting from the moment he could, physically squeeze a trigger, and his dad was an avid deer hunter, and he took it even, a few steps past what his dad ever got into it. And his dad was very avid. And that friend is actually Garrett Fike. I just had him on my podcast last night. And um, uh, Fike, as we called him, he kind of showed my brother what shed hunting was a little bit. And so, I kind of knew by proxy, oh, Fike goes out and looks for sheds. And then when we were in college. My brother and I went to the same college, and I was working on a second degree, and he was an incoming freshman. And that year on spring break, he like went to. He had a friend who grew up on a ranch in Colorado, and he like brought all of his friends home for spring break. And Jake was one of those friends, my brother Jake. And one of the things they did is like, hey guys, every year this time of year, I like to go out and we go and find all these mule deer sheds. And so Jake goes shed hunting and he brings back home a couple nice mule deer sheds. And so like I keep having these like brush-ins with shed hunting. And honestly, during that time, Andrew, like I grew up loving to go fishing. I grew up um, backpacking with my dad in Montana. I think I've been through this probably in a previous podcast, but I grew up around the outdoors, but I kind of fell away from it when I was in college. You know, I got more into just what most people do. You know, slack jaw, sports watching on TV, couch potato. You know,
I
and
feel like that's such a common thing that happens. You
I
hear about the
know.
guy who grew up hunting and then they go to college and then they don't do it again.
Yep.
And yeah, it seems pretty
And
common.
you know, I kind of fell away from it, but I got back into fishing kind of through Fike, because Fike invited me to go. How did that work? I think he invited me to go bow fishing, and I went bow fishing with Fike. It's like, man, I really love being in the outdoors and all this. So I got really hardcore back into fishing for a short time there. Well, then my wife and I we moved, and we previously lived in a spot for like good shore fishing, and we moved to an area to the Quad City area where I grew up, but like the fishing around there was like the Mississippi River. So if you had a boat, like man, it's as good a fishing as you could get. I didn't have a boat, and um uh you know, so I kind of like got out of fishing, but I still really wanted to be in the outdoors. And there was this like city park that was very wooded, in a very urban area, but it was a big city park with a lot of timber and like some ag land around the outside of it. And you know, we would go there and hike. They had a great, very popular like bike path that ran through there. We'd go out there and walk our dog, or we didn't have a dog yet actually. We would just walk, the two of us. And you know, you'd see deer sign and see deer out there, and I'd be like, man, I bet you I could go shed hunting out here. If I go shed hunting, Jake went shed hunting out in Colorado and all that. And so I like decided this winter I'm going to get into shed hunting. And I'm telling you, Andrew, I read every article the internet had to offer, and which was like six at that time. And I really wish it, I mean, knowing what I know now, right, about how hunting media works, if I would have just, you know, of course, I wouldn't have had any authority to write on anything because I hadn't even found a shed yet at this point in my life. But man, if I could have been writing shed hunting articles back then, oh, you know, like the Google dominance I would have on shed hunting
Oh yeah.
would be just out of this world. So I read like all those articles, and I'm not kidding you, every one of them. It was, you remember like the days of the overhead projectors in school,
Oh yeah.
and they'd like print out like actual type onto the overhead projector and they like put it up in front of the room. You could have done that with all of these articles and they would have matched up like almost identically. Like everyone was saying the exact same tips. They're saying, oh, make sure you, you know, the classic was, you know, they'd give you like three tips on how to find, like where to find sheds and stuff. And then like the final tip would be like, and make sure you bring a backpack. You got to bring your stuff that you're going to need. It's like, come on, that is not a tip. You know what I mean? I want to find sheds, but so there's all these like really like low quality articles, and I was reading them all, and it was actually kind of fun because it was still like, because shed hunting was still kind of a, I don't know, undiscovered thing by most people at that point. I actually remember my father-in-law, because he knew I was getting into it, he found, or he saw like a newspaper article on shed hunting, and they live out in New Hampshire. And so he like cut out this newspaper article and mailed it to me. You know, it was like still, it was like almost the 90s, you know, as far as, do you remember like the days? I know you're younger than I am, but do you remember the days where like, where if you had like this subject that you were interested in that was not mainstream, you had to like you had to like you would get so excited when you'd be reading like a hunting magazine or a fishing magazine or whatever, and that one like niche topic that you're really interested in, you there'd be like this little like, single column, not even an article, just like a little blurb on whatever it was.
Uh-huh.
You just like read that thing like 50 times because that was the only information you could find. It was a little bit like that still when I was getting into it. Now today, I got probably 6 articles on shed hunting on my website alone. You know what I mean? And there's a million of them out there, and it's definitely been discovered. But it was fun getting into it kind of in that old school way where there wasn't a lot out there. I had to rely a lot on friends and talking to them on how to find them, and I would just go back to that same park every day, the same urban park after work. And I'd drag my wife along most times, but then she started getting sick of the snow and stuff, and then I'd call up my brother-in-law and he'd come out. And finally this one day, I must have searched this spot five, six, 7, 8 times, and I suddenly walk by and spot my first ever shed. And I should have brought it up here. It's downstairs in my kitchen. But I like almost couldn't believe it when I spotted that. And I just remember like the I don't know, the impact it had. It sounds everyone's probably rolling their eyes at me. Uh, the impact it had picking that thing up off the ground and being like, man, this was on a buck's head, and he had to walk through this one little way here because there's just no way he could have fit walking through any other way. And it just felt so powerful, and it became one of my most prized possessions at that very moment. I remember when we moved later on in that spring, because we were in an apartment, we bought a house. I remember I was extra careful to keep track of which box that shed was in. It was one of the first things I unpacked when we got to the new house and put it up on my dresser because I was proud of that thing, and basically from that moment on, I was, I was totally hooked on going and finding sheds, and I still hadn't even gone deer hunting yet.
That's awesome. All right, two things. One,
Yeah.
do you want to go get it? I don't know how long it'll
Yeah,
take,
yeah,
but
yeah,
you
yeah.
can go get it.
Hit pause real quick. I'll go snag it so we can show
Okay.
show the listeners or viewers. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that.
Oh no, you're good. As soon as you mentioned it, I was like, I need to ask if he wants to get it. All right, we are
Yeah.
back. I just started the recording again right as you walked back in, so we are back. So you have your first ever shed, and while you're grabbing it, the second thing I wanted to ask, it sounds like your first time. So you committed that winter to going shed hunting, and you found your first shed that winter, right?
Yeah, yeah, I did. I found it, and I literally had searched the same park. I don't know, probably I bet I'd hit it at least, I bet 10 times at this point, and I'm walking off all the trails. I'm going down into, all these areas, and looking back, a lot of a lot of those areas were just very low odds that I'd ever find a shed there. But some of the areas I looked in were good too, and I was definitely learning about deer sign, what a rub was, what a scrape was, what like where would I expect to find a lot of tracks? Where would I expect to, I started to learn a lot of that um I guess baseline scouting intel that has helped me now as an avid deer hunter. So it was pretty cool. And here's the actual first shed I found. So I'll try and just this. Of course, this is like a year and a half year old buck. At that time, I
Yeah.
probably thought he was like a 10-year-old buck. I had no idea what I was doing, but it was just this little shed here, and this thing was just so special to me. I couldn't I couldn't I couldn't imagine um you know I guess I couldn't imagine myself actually ever finding one. And so when I did, um I was just so excited. And I actually have my second shed I ever found as well. I grabbed that while I was down there. I found this in
Nice.
another city park after we moved, like 20 minutes away. And this was again another urban park, more rural though, much more rural than this first park that I was in. And then actually, here's the third shed I ever found. This one's kind of cool. This
What?
little dinky spike. Found
How
that
do you
at
even find that?
well, this was I think this would have been my second year of shed hunting. And yeah, I I found it in a county park, and I had just been driving through there trying to see where deer were, and I saw that they had bird feeders in this county park, and I was like, you know what? I bet you deer go around those bird feeders and hang around them and steal some of the spilled feed and stuff. And I didn't find it right next to the feeder, but I found it, maybe 50, 60 yards away. And it took a huge chunk of this buck's skull with it, though, when it shed. That had to be uncomfortable. Big piece of
Yeah.
pedicle there. But no, it's pretty amazing to find this little thing. And I was hooked. I was hooked very early on, and it's still, when I get into shed season, I can't tell you which I like more, bow hunting or shed hunting.
Do you ever think about how big those deer got? Those first ones that you
Mm.
saw, like how big they ended up getting, or is it like, wow, this is cool, and then they kind of just, faded
That's a
away? Not,
that's a
I don't know.
that's a really good question. As much as I have handled and looked at and stared at and reminisced about when I found those sheds, I don't know if that thought has ever crossed my head. That is a great question. I've always kind of viewed shed hunting kind of disjointedly from actual hunting, and I think a lot of that comes from the fact that all my shed hunting starting out was done on public land. And so I just had to, there was no way I was going to, these weren't even areas you could hunt. I think
Hmm.
the county park, you could technically get a special bow hunting permit, but even that was like doe only or something. And so these were bucks that I was never going to hunt. And so I guess I kind of viewed, starting out, and plus I didn't, I shed hunted before I hunted. I kind of viewed those things as separate, shed hunting and deer hunting. Whereas I know a lot of guys view shed hunting as an important part of scouting. And I obviously understand that. And
Hmm.
those guys usually just limit their shed hunting to areas where they're going to hunt. And if they find one shed, great. If they find 20 sheds, great. That's the only place they're going. Whereas my friend Caleb and I, who is just as obsessed as I am with shed hunting, will knock on an endless number of doors, and we'll try and go to all sorts of places to shed hunt that we'll never ever get a chance to hunt. And and that's okay because we love shed hunting for what it is.
That is fascinating. I don't think I've ever heard anyone mention that they knock on doors. I know you've mentioned, and I want to get to that later, that you've done shed hunting trips, and that's something I
Yeah.
definitely want to talk about. But something that you mentioned earlier that I think would be worth taking a detour on right now and talking about. You mentioned that you learned about rubs and some pattern stuff, and I've
Hmm.
heard you on other podcasts say that shed hunting makes you a better hunter overall.
Oh, no
And I'd
doubt
love for
about
you
it.
to kind of talk about that, and for people like me or others that might be listening that kind of don't think too much about shed hunting, what those
Hmm.
benefits might be.
Yeah, that's a really good question there, and absolutely, it makes you a better hunter. The the way it does so is it um it allows you to interact with more deer, and you're constantly asking yourself several questions, right? First of all, as I look at this landscape, it's kind of like fishing, right? What is it? 90% of the fish are in 10% of the water or something like that. The
Hmm.
same thing for shed hunting, right? Although I like to say 95% of the sheds are in 5% of the land. Um, and so when you're looking at whether it's through e-scouting, which is usually where it starts, just like a hunt, right? You're looking at, okay, where are the key terrain features that I like for shed hunting, which is always going to be start with big block of habitat. Okay. Um, because I shed hunt here in Iowa, any kind of forested area over 10 acres is going to be a place that you want that's going to get your attention. And the bigger the better. Then from there you want it to be a south facing hill, and you want that timber to be near the top of that hill. For whatever reason, bottomland shed hunting just hasn't been super productive for me. I've definitely found them in bottomland type habitat, like the first ever shed I found. That was in a bottomland area, not far from a pretty sizable creek. Um, and the uh, bulk of my sheds, though, they're found uphill where bucks. I think it's just the bucks like to have a wind and sight advantage, and I think bottomland can just be cold. Like that cold air
Hmm.
sinks down into those bottoms, and so I think it's just easier to survive up high, even though it is windier and you get blasted more by that. I just think they can find a way to use the terrain to get out of the wind a little bit, use cedar trees or native grasses and things like that to hunker down and stay warmer than they can down in the bottomland. So I'm looking for areas like that. And then of course you need food close by because you're dealing with a late season deer. This is the time of year where they're run down from the rut. They need calories. They need to survive the cold. They want to minimize their energy output, and so you can kind of focus on that. So right there, you're becoming a better hunter, right? Because hunting is just putting pieces of the puzzle together. And so that's what you're doing. You're just solving a puzzle. You're putting all this stuff together to figure out where is the maximum number of deer, because that's the other part of it. It's a little bit different if you're targeting a specific buck and you're just wanting that buck's sheds, like my friend Noel Gandy will do. Then you might do things a little bit differently. But for me, I mean, sure, I just usually don't have like it's just the way I've approached deer hunting, and I'm not saying my way is right. I'm just not super interested in like dialing in on one or two specific bucks. I mean, yeah, usually I got a couple on my mind that I saw
Hmm.
the year before or I've gotten on camera or whatever. I'm like, man, sure would be great to kill him, but I'm not that picky. And I just like I don't know, I like being surprised as well. So I like to just find an area where the most amount of deer, and then I from there I try and dissect. Okay, not only where am I going to find a lot of deer, but where am I going to find the bucks? Because those two things are different. You can if you go into a doe bedding area, you can tell immediately. There's like a million beds from that doe family group. They're all very close together. They do not play the topography as much. They play the cover more. So if there's a really thick area of cedars or conifers, um, then you'll find a million beds in there, and they're all does and yearling bucks, maybe. Um, or buck fawns, really is probably a better term for them, the young of the year. And so, I mean, you might find a spike in there, but you're probably not going to find much. Whereas a buck, he's going to be out more on his own. Maybe they kind of batch up a little bit, but a lot of bucks just kind of lone wolf it through the winter, really, from what I've observed. And so you're trying to find those more isolated pieces of cover. There again, making you a better hunter, right? Because the same thing starts to apply when you get to October, in steer season and into, bucks have gone hard horned and they kind of split up out of their bachelor groups and they're kind of seeking out these isolated bedding areas, places where they can just be by themselves. And so you're learning those skills. And then the other thing that helps is for late season hunting. I mean, how often do we get to the end of the season and we still have tags to fill? And that could be a really, really challenging time to fill a tag. A lot of people are like, man, I love late muzz, and that's great. But I'm guessing it's because you have and probably always have had access to great late season hunting. And that is a major limiting factor for most hunters. Myself, my family owns, you know, uh, you know, probably, I don't know, close to 800 acres of land, and um, none of it is good for late season hunting. Um, one farm is kind of okay, but the deer just aren't there, and one of those farms has great habitat on it, great habitat, but it's not what they're looking for in the late season. And so shed hunting can, especially if you build a relationship with doing some of this permission seeking, you can line yourself up with some good late season ground, because that's where those bucks are hanging out when they're shedding. And so it helps you from that regard as well. It can help you find a spot to hunt where you can fill a tag during the time of year when it's the hardest time to fill a tag.
Interesting. Yeah, so many things were going through my mind while you were talking. I'm like, all right, is the pattern that they're going to use the same? Because the isolation is similar, but I
Yeah.
feel like they're going to be even more isolated in the late season. So that made me think, is it even worth it to like no, hear me out. Is it even worth it to use it as a tool for targeting deer versus just understanding where bucks like to be? Because the pattern that they're using, and I mean, we haven't talked about when is peak dropping season, but I think we're almost
Hmm.
there. I feel like the pattern that they're using there is not going to be the same pattern that they use in October or December. Here in late December in Tennessee, that's about when the rutting seems to stop.
Hmm.
So I almost feel like it helps you learn, like you were talking about the terrain, the behavior in general. But in my mind, I would use it similar to not from a learning how to hunt, but for like I use trail cameras, for example, just to understand what's in the area. Am I
Hmm.
even close? Because
Right.
sometimes I've been to places that look perfect on the map and there's nothing there. And
Yeah.
I almost feel like shed hunting could be that sort of like that. It's like, all right, this is the quality and the type of deer that's in this area,
Yep.
particularly in the late season. And that doesn't mean that they're going to be there during the archery opener, but you're learning these skills, what to look for, different types of terrain, understanding buck behavior, and you're also getting inventory. It's kind of like the route that my brain was going while you were talking about it.
Yeah, you're spot on with all those thoughts. It really does not apply directly to any point in the hunting season except for the late season. It can definitely, it's a strong correlation to the late season, especially if it's a snowy, cold late season. They're going to be in the exact spots they're going to be during shed season. And so it is an excellent correlation there, but you're exactly right when it comes to October. Um, Other than like an inventory standpoint, like you said, no, there's very little correlation. However, I will say this: there's a guy that I've interviewed before on my show, and he talked about Clint Deer Hunter DVM is what he's known as. He writes for North American Whitetail. He's just a great deer hunter. He talks about how he will in February time of year he will get back into the woods, but he'll put his earbuds in. Or no, no, no. How does he how does he do this? He refuses to look for sheds in February, but he's in the woods and he's just scouting. He's just looking for rubs and scrapes, bedding areas, any kind of, heavily used trails, any kind of little detail. And he says, if I find a shed, great, but that's not why I'm there, and that's not what I'm looking for. Then when he gets to shed season, then he puts his earbuds in, and all he does, and he cranks music, and all he does is scour the ground for sheds, and then he's looking for sheds. And I don't do it the same way Clint does, but I don't think it's a bad idea, and it illustrates the point that you do get that intel that's left on the landscape from the fall before, like the rubs, the scrapes. You can usually tell a bedding area that's a little bit old. You can tell a trail that was probably hot in November but has gone cold now during the off season. Leaves are blown over it, and there's no fresh tracks and stuff like that, right? And so that part is very helpful, and very applicable to using during October and November earlier in the year. But yeah, as far as where the bucks are spending their time and how they're using the vegetation and everything in uh, February compared to October, there's very little correlation in most places.
Okay. So when would you say is that peak shed hunting season? Like when do you target for shed hunting?
Yeah. Well, my friend Garrett Fike found his first match set on the last day of November and first day of December this year. Uh, a giant buck, too, in Illinois. That is extremely rare. That is an anomaly. But it does happen. There are bucks that'll drop every year, I'm sure, in December. And generally speaking, the bucks that do that are unhealthy. They have something that's wrong with them. I should have foreseen this, and I should have brought another shed up here to illustrate this point. I'll show you on this shed that I have sitting here. Uh, so so this shed here is if you look at the base of the shed here, generally call this, a lot of people call it the pedicle, and that's kind of a misnomer. Um, it's a better term for it is the burr, and it is technically part of the pedicle, but the pedicle is really the part on their skull where the antler has grown out of, right? And um, the osteoclasts, which are bone cells that break down bone tissue. They're specialized cells that help break down bone tissue. We have them in our bodies. They help get rid of old bone cells to replace with new bone cells, and the cells that do that are called osteoblasts. So osteoclasts will pick up their activity in, you know, basically as soon as the testosterone levels start to drop on that buck, they those osteoclast numbers will start to rise, and they'll start to break away at the in between the burr and the pedicle on the buck's skull. And then eventually, the mass of the antler will become uh, heavier than where the tissue is still attached to the skull, and the antler will drop. And so, if you see an antler that is sticking out like this, where it has that convex uh, burr right there, or you can call it pedicle, I guess is fine too. Where that sticks out, that's actually a sign of health. That shows that buck is doing okay. He probably wasn't injured or any other kind of problem. But going back to the first ever shed that I found, it kind of illustrates this. And I don't think this buck was unhealthy. It just kind of shows for sake of example. Whereas I'll tell you about a buck sheds that I found one other time. But here you can look on this antler here. You can kind of see how that sticks in. So
It's pretty
maybe he
flat.
was
Yeah.
right. So it goes in under here, under this edge of the burr right here. Um, that that could be, um, and maybe he did have an injury or something. Maybe he had a really stressful rut. Maybe he got hit by a car. It's an urban buck. So there's you can kind of look at an antler like that to get a general idea of the health of the buck. Well, if a buck sheds super early, a lot of times that's going to be very concave. And in fact, one year I was squirrel hunting on Martin Luther King Jr. Weekend with my friend Luke Fritch, and we were hunting in this timber across from his house. All of a sudden, I come across this dead, this deer carcass, and I'm looking at it, and I notice his. You could see on this buck's skull, he had really bloody pedicles on his skull. And that's typical. If you find a very fresh shed, like what's kind of cool about this first ever shed I found, when you look here at that, see how that's all brown right there? That's
Hmm.
all dried blood. Now, sheds that have been sitting out for, a few weeks, they'll be white. They'll be all white there. But when it's a fresh shed, it'll have a little bit of blood there. And these bases on his skull were just super bloody, but he was totally devoured by coyotes. I mean, all of his hide was all ripped off. It's like, man, he got he shed and then he died. Like he did not go long after he shed his antlers because those bases are still
Yeah.
so bloody. And I was like, "Hey, Luke, look, come see what I found over here." He was like bit in the middle of chasing a squirrel around a tree, and so after he got done with that, he comes walking over. I'm like, "Look at this! This thing is, you know, this was a big buck, and he shed both of his antlers before he died. I mean, these sheds could be like within a quarter of a mile from here." And he goes, "Oh, here they are." And he was like 5 yards away from this dead buck were these two giant sheds, like 60 some inch sheds, stacked on
Wow.
top of each other. And here's the crazy part, Andrew. We had a major ice storm on New Year's Day. This was like January 20th, when we were out there. We came across this buck still very early in the shed season, but he had already shed his antlers before that ice storm. And the way I know it was because they were buried under that ice. When did he shed? I don't know, but it had to be in December. And so when you then looked at his sheds and look at the bases of those sheds right around the burr there, once I learned this tip, I think it was from National Deer Association. Kip Adams, I think, was the one who there was a video of him talking about it. I think I go pick up that shed. Sure enough, big old concave indentation on the bottom there. And so, all that to say, something was wrong with that buck, whether he got injured during the hunting season, during the rut, whatever, something was wrong with him. Coyotes get caught up to him, but I don't think he got his antlers knocked off of his head while they were eating him, and that they dragged him away because
Hmm.
they looked like they had to have dropped to be stacked like that and under the ice. He died, within 5 yards of where he shed those antlers. And so you can find sheds this time of year. Usually it's because a buck isn't doing so hot. So if you wound a buck during archery season or whatever, and you really want to get that buck shed, so then you need to be out there early because they're going to drop early most likely. But as far as like when does peak shedding happen? Well, that testosterone level is dumping off after the rut is done. That is a I think the right term is phototropic response, but I could be wrong on that. Or photo period response, maybe is a better term, where the amount of daylight hours triggers a hormonal response in the buck. I believe it's the same way for does when they're going into heat for breeding. The same thing happens to bucks, but with instead of estrogen, of course, it's testosterone, and those testosterone levels dump off. Their antlers begin the shedding process, and most antlers are on the ground, I would say, by March 15th at this latitude. If you go further north, things obviously get darker the closer you go to the North Pole during the winter. And so they tend to drop a little bit earlier than my latitude here in southern Iowa. If you go further south, things are even more different down there. I think right now, like in Mississippi and Alabama, it's the rut going on right
Yeah.
now, and so things are a lot different down there. So, but around here, March 15th, I'd say most antlers are on the ground. That being said, I think through the years, I have found the majority of my sheds in April. April is just, I think it's just because all sheds are on the ground by April. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like there's just, yeah, most of them are on the ground by March 15th, but they're still like, they're still probably like a good 40% on bucks heads, or something like that, or 30%. And so once you get to April, and the other thing about finding sheds in April is most people have given up on shed hunting by that point. Everyone hits it hard in March. Usually go out 1 or 2 weekends, but I keep going. Sometimes I'll go into early May, and eventually it gets too green and overgrown to be able to see anything. But yeah, I'd say around that March 15th time frame, and then anything leading up to that is just very few and far between, but you still find them, in January and February.
Wow. Okay. So could be, depending on where you live, quite a wide season.
Hmm.
And peak for you, you've had the most success in April. So that's good to know. When it comes to terrain, you were talking about south facing slopes, looking for big batches of timber, and you're basically focusing on, I guess, buck bedding habitat, right? Like
Hmm.
that's, are there any other specific terrain features, whether it's in Iowa or any of the trips that you've taken? Are there any other areas that you target when you're e-scouting, or if you just go straight boots on the ground?
Yeah, definitely. Let me maybe paint the picture of a perfect spot. If I can see on while I'm e-scouting, if I can see um a heavily timbered area, um so a spot that's got not just timber on the property where I have access, but the neighbors have a lot of timber, and or maybe there's a public land area there that's got a big block of timber. But how much timber for a square for that square mile am I looking at? And if it's a lot, okay, that's great. That's where I'm looking. And then from there, I want to find an area that's, like you said, got southern exposure. But the key here is then, does it transition into food and native grass nearby? And if not native grass, just some kind of grass transitioning from that timber to grass to food on a southern exposure area, that is dynamite. And it's specifically corn. Now, not always the biggest shed, which I'll show you right now. That I've ever found. I found this one in a
Whoa.
yeah. This is a giant. Um, it's crazy. Caleb and I drove right past this thing in a cut bean field, um, on our way in to go shed hunt on this
Wow.
farm. And on our way back, I saw it and I jumped out of the vehicle while it was still moving to go pick that thing up. I just like went out of my mind when I found that thing. But that was in a cut bean field, and so you do find them out there in bean fields from time to time. But I think the beans don't last as well in the soil through especially under snow. I think they get mushy and rotten faster than the corn does. In fact, I know they do. And so they're just not as they don't end up spending as much time out in a harvested bean field as they do in a cornfield. And I've had it where that exact scenario that I told you about there, where you had all those different features converging together. I've had areas like that where I want to say Caleb and I found in that one field, not all in one shed hunt. We went back to the same area multiple times. I bet we found 25 plus sheds within, um, I don't know, 60 acres, something like that. I mean, it just
Wow.
shows you the power of when you get all of those conditions just lining up together. And then from there, some other things you asked, are there other features beyond that? Definitely. Another thing that I should have thrown in there is I'm looking on the map for a sparsely populated area, an area that's free. If this area can be free from like sight line from a house, or free from like a busy road. Now the spot that I told you about where we found those 25 sheds, it wasn't that far from a road, so they'll tolerate some of that. But like if there's a house close by, you got dogs barking, you got people slamming car doors all the time, you don't like that. They can get used to a little bit of that, but if they can go 100 yards in another direction and be away from all of that, they'll do it. And so you want to try and find a spot that's sparsely populated by humans, and uh you know think of things like wind direction too. Get a lot of northwest winds in the winter. Are they going to hunker down on a, what is that called, the leeward side, where they're out of the wind
Hmm.
and sheltered that way? Are there different types of trees? Maybe there's some red oaks in there, so they could maybe get some. All the white oak acorns are gone by that time of the year, but the red oaks, they have that extra tannic acid in them, which helps them survive from rotting like the white oak acorns do. But also they aren't as palatable early in the year, and so they kind of hang around longer on the ground. So if you got some like red oaks, or you got um, a lot of coniferous trees, evergreen trees, things that do great at blocking the wind. Those little, or even locust pods. Um, the locust pods can be a good late season food source when things get really, really rough for the deer. So um, there's a couple different additional features that I look for like that as well.
Okay. I want to flip it now. So we've
Yeah,
talked about a few things that are good. And this might make you think. I don't know if you've been asked this question before, but I've done this on a not on a podcast, but I've done this with my day job. Um, Instead of like, what advice would you give me to start? What are the top mistakes that I shouldn't make? Like, what are the things that if you could tell me, do not do this when you're
yeah,
e-scouting or when you're going to go shed hunting? Like, what are your top, 3 to 5? Don't do this.
yeah. That's another good question. Don't feel like you have to search every square inch. Just like I was saying earlier, 5% or 95% of the sheds are on 5% of the map. Um, a lot of time, when I first started, I'd think, well, boy, Grandpa's got 200 and some acres. I guess I better search all 200 acres to turn up any shed that's out there, and it's just not going to work. That's not going to happen.
Hmm.
And you'll be spending your time searching ground that there's never been a shed on. Um, uh, Maybe at least for a couple thousand years, anyways. There there's so many more acres where there are no sheds than there are acres that are. So don't feel like you have to scour every square inch. Now, maybe if you're trying to match up like a really cool buck, you have one of his sides already and you're trying to find the match, okay, yeah, then you might do some grid searching. But then I would also say within that, don't obsess over finding matches. Um, it's a myth that most matches are located within 100 yards of the other side. I have found a lot of sheds through the years, and um, I have found very few matches. Now I have like the match set that we found off that dead buck. Um, they were laying on top of each other. And another time, my son and I, we found a match set where they were, laying 2 yards away from each other, or not even that, 1 yard away from each other. But most of the time, match sets, a buck will carry it for a while. He might go a day, maybe 2 days before he sheds that other side. One time, Caleb and I were shed hunting with my brother in law, and he found his first ever shed in that spot where we found like 25 sheds. And um, he we ended up finding the match to that shed 7/10 of a mile away on a complete separate landowner's farm. And
Wow.
it just shows and it was probably a situation where that buck wore that other side around for maybe a day, maybe 2 days. And so if you obsess over finding the match, you can end up wasting a lot of time on, non-productive searches. And so, definitely do, try the 100-yard radius rule, but if you're not finding it, don't obsess. Move on and uh, cover more ground. And so definitely that. And then it's so cliche, but it's so true. Miles for the piles. You have to cover a lot of ground to be able to find a lot of sheds, and there's just no way around that. And I have a couple rules that apply here in Iowa. Now, this is obviously going to be different in Southwest Wisconsin, where they have way more deer than what we have here in Iowa. But I have found it to be um, uh, uh, pretty dang accurate. I have to find 5 dead deer before I find a shed. I mean, it's spooky how accurate that is. You usually find 5 dead deer. You think that's crazy, but you will find
I
five
do.
dead deer between each shed you find a lot of the time. It's why I mean they're not fresh kills from that year. It might be a 10-year-old
Yeah.
carcass and you just find one bone, but it's spooky. One time that match set I was telling you about that I found with my son, I was teaching school at that time, and I had told my students because I taught this class at the end of every school day called How to Hunt, which is kind of cool to teach. And I told the students in that class is like, hey, I've found, I've hiked about 8 or 9 miles so far this season. I haven't found anything yet, which I'll tell you that part of it here in a second. And I found like 4 dead deer. So, as soon as I find one more deer, I'm due to find a shed. And I kid you not, Andrew, I found a dead deer, and I said to myself, "All right, time to find a shed." It wasn't 2 minutes, and I found that match set. It's weird.
That's
It's some
amazing.
kind of rhythm in the universe, but it's not always perfect. Sometimes you might find three, or you might find two, or you might find four, but roughly 5 dead deer in between sheds. It's wild. And the other part of that is in the early season. Um, and if you're like a new shed hunter or just like an average shed hunter, I'd say you got to plan on 10 miles between each shed. 10 miles of walking between each shed that you find. Now, when I'm really having a good year and I'm really on point with my shed hunting, I've had it to where it might be 2.5 miles in between sheds, and that's just I've done a good job at keying in on the good areas, but also I've been blessed with some really critically good shed hunting permission, and so there's like little rhythms like that to what you can expect, and I think it's important to have those metrics in your brain if you decide to go shed hunting, because it can get really discouraging. 10 miles is a lot of walking. There's been times where I've
Yeah, it
invested like
is.
almost an entire Saturday into shed hunting and come up empty, and it's just like, come on. But that's just part of it. It's just part of it. It's not easy, and there's a lot of walking that you got to do if you're going to find a lot of sheds.
This has definitely helped me reset my expectations and help me with the areas I want to target. I knew it was a lot of
Yeah.
miles. People always say miles for the piles, but they don't
Yep.
actually tell you how many miles.
That's right.
The dead deer thing is interesting, and I've always thought, oh, just target buck bedding. But now I have an understanding of specific terrain features that
Yeah.
I might want to look for, and understanding that every geographic location is different.
Right.
And like the way I approach, there's two different areas near me that I have hunted. One is nothing but timber with hills. It's not, obviously it doesn't have the terrain elevation that the Northeast does, like New
Yeah.
Hampshire, upstate New York, but it's that kind of habitat where it's
Mm-hmm.
all dense timber, no fields, no openings, just lots of hills.
Yep.
And then I have other areas where it's a mix of like bean fills.
Very
Yeah,
few
oh, it's
sheds in that
kind of.
timber. Yep. In that timber,
Oh, I
very
bet.
few
I bet.
sheds. I should have mentioned
And
that one. That's a very common mistake new shed hunters do, myself included when I was new, is I would just hammer timbered areas. I would just scour forests and I would find very few sheds. And I talked to Garrett Fike about it. And he's like, oh, I find like 0 sheds in the timber. I could look for grassy areas near a food source. And once again, kind of spooky. That second shed that I ever found, I think it's up here. Yep. The shed here. Um, I literally got done texting him and he had told me that like a half an hour later. I pulled up into the parking lot at this city park, or yeah, city park, and I knew there was this like prairie planting right by the parking lot, and I walked in there with my dog, and like literally 3 feet into that prairie, I found that shed. There's a grassy area next to
that's
on
awesome.
the neighboring farm had a ag field right there, and so you're exactly right on the timber, that thick timber. Unless you really want to go check out that timber, for scouting value, you're probably not
I'm
there'll be
probably gonna.
sheds in there, but I mean there it's like one or two, you know.
Yeah, I didn't really hunt in there this season. I just have a couple of cameras out there looking because
Mm-hmm.
the density by comparison to other areas that like the other public areas that I can hunt, the deer density is completely different, but the hunter density is also very different. So
Mm,
that's part of the reason why I'm like, maybe I'll go out there and try
yep.
something different. but this has seriously helped me significantly with understanding. So, any last minute tips, anything that we didn't talk about that you think like, man, I really should tell Andrew this before he
Yeah.
goes shed hunting this year?
Yeah, yeah. The last thing I would say is if you're struggling finding those key spots, take the long way home from work. Go out and drive, back roads and just look for where deer are hanging out this time of year. Sometimes it doesn't match those locations that I just talked about. Prime example would be yesterday afternoon on my way home from work. I went on this way roundabout way, and it actually was not far from where I spotted a 200 plus inch buck back in 2023. And I've been trying to get eyes on that buck again. And I tried to get in contact with or I did get in contact with one of the landowners, and she just smiled and said, "He's big, isn't he?" And I go, "Uh-huh." and she's like, "Well, sorry, my son's trying to kill him." And so other people knew about him, so maybe somebody got him. But I've been trying to get eyes on this buck for 2 years, or a year and a half now since I last saw him. But I drove around this area that was a bottom. So there again, sometimes there's an exception to the rules. It was a bottom. It was a long line of timber. It's a timber draw along a creek, and they're out in that field. Now here's where it kind of goes back to what I was saying though. There was a finger of timber that kind of was going uphill from that bottom. It was grassy around the edge, and then there was corn, and there was like 10 deer right there. Very little timber, but the most timber in that area. And bingo, there's the deer. And then down, I don't know, 500 yards south of them, but still kind of in that same line of habitat, that timber draw, there were two other what I think were bucks, a buck fawn and a year and a half year old buck, and the year and a half year old buck looked like he was already missing one of his sides, and they were actually in a cut bean field. And so there are exceptions to the rules, but in general, and I wouldn't know that about that area unless I'd just taken that route home and spotted where those deer were hanging out. And that can really help you zero in your search. I mean, still miles for the piles, but now I'm putting some miles on my truck instead of on my feet, and trying to be efficient with where I get my permission. And that's the other part of it too. Try and get permission. People are much more apt to letting you shed hunt than bow hunt. And when I go get permission, I bring a business card so they have my contact information if they need to get a hold of me. They know I have a job, so I'm a respectable human being, not some bum, that's just out here and freeloading and interested in finding a place
Uh-huh.
to stash meth or something like that out on their farm. And I'm they know who I am then to some degree. And I say, I'm just interested in finding sheds, and would you be okay with me looking? And you almost always they're like, yeah, go ahead. And then you try and get a little information too, and be like, you ever pick them up like in your tractor tires or anything like that when you're out doing field work? And if they're like, oh yeah, I hate that. Last year we had two tires we had to replace on our tractor. It cost me $X thousand, and right there that they're going to want you to find those sheds, so they're going to want you to come back. But also there are sheds, right? If they're like, no, I've never seen one, well, you better get ready for a nature walk, because if they've never seen any sheds out there, you're probably not on that 5% of the map that you need to be on. However, there almost always you got a chance at finding at least one shed. You know what I mean? And so it's still worth it to go out there and walk. And I just love to see new country. That's really so I guess I should say this too, Andrew. There's two things I love about shed hunting. Number one, I get to explore habitat that would otherwise I wouldn't have a reason to go into, right? And especially if it's closed for hunting permission, you ever wonder just like what's on the other side of that property line? I wonder what that timber looks like from that angle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now you can find out, and I love that. And I think that's part of the that's an ancient part of what it means to be a human. We're curious about what's over the next hill, and so I get to answer that question for myself when I go shed hunting. And then the other part is I get to interact with so many different bucks. I bucked out in Iowa this year. I shot two bucks. I got to handle two bucks. Okay, great, awesome. I love them.
Yeah.
So thankful for them. But I got to handle two bucks. Whereas last year shed hunting, I think I found 15 sheds, and I don't think any of them were matches. So I got to handle 15 different bucks through shed hunting. And so there are people that laugh. I've had a guy once when I was interviewing on my podcast. I was talking about shed hunting, and this was back in the days before we would use video and stuff. And we had turned off the videos on our chat because I was having a hard time with bandwidth. And he didn't turn his video off, and I don't think he knew it. And I tried telling him, but he like I don't know what the problem was there. But he didn't think his camera was on, and I could see he was laughing at me when I talked about how I like going shed hunting. Like he thought it was so stupid. And it's like, dude, I I don't understand why it's stupid to be outside stretching my legs, learning about deer, learning about where they want to live, learning about their habits and their behavior. Like you mentioned earlier, getting an inventory on what bucks are in this area and getting to spend more time with these critters that I love so much and admire so much. And so to me, it answers all of those things that make me tick. And with shed hunting, you don't have to worry about scent control and being loud and all the stuff that makes us all strung out and stressed out during, archery season, and kind of get a break from that.
Uh-huh. I can't think of a more like insightful and impactful way to end it. So before I ask you any more questions, I just want to say thank you because I
Absolutely,
don't know
man.
that we can top that. And every time we talk, I feel like I always learn so much and take so much away from it. So I appreciate you talking to me and having me on too. I think we're going to broadcast this again.
Yeah,
So thank you so much for having me on. If you are listening to this on the Endure Hunt podcast, please give Kent a follow. I'm going to drop all of his social media, everything on there. It's First Gen Hunter. Check out the podcast. Check out his Instagram. He posts stuff all the time. Please give him a follow. He is a great friend, and I'm very very grateful to have you and have met you and connected with you. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you again, man. I can't wait to have you back on.
absolutely, man. Thanks for putting this together. No, it was great talking with you. Always enjoy it. You're a fellow first gen brother, and man, we got to put a hunt together here soon, and a shed hunt. Definitely gotta do some shed
Yeah,
hunting. You have to come up here to Iowa. Maybe what we can do is the year you think you're gonna draw, come up in the spring, and we'll kind of pre-scout, do a little shed hunting, and you can figure out where you're gonna be wanting to, put your. I think you saddle hunt too, don't you?
I do now. Yeah, I got
Yeah.
a saddle this year.
Yep. So you
That sounds great.
prep some trees and stuff like that. So, but no, I appreciate you having me on again, buddy, and always good hanging out with you.
That is it with Kent. Thank you so much for coming back on. I always have a great conversation with you. I hope that the audience got as much out of this as I did. To close out the podcast, as I always say, time is our most valuable asset. I don't take it for granted that you chose to spend it with me. I hope that you got something out of this podcast, and I'll see you all next time.